Hello, everyone. I'm Rob Satloff. I'm the director of the Washington Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this very special policy forum event that we're convening here virtually from Afghanistan to the Middle East, implications of the U.S. withdrawal and Taliban victory. I'm sure everyone on this call has their own views on the wisdom of the decision by the president to withdraw American forces from Afghanistan, the strategic decision. And I'm sure everyone on this call has views on the efficacy of the execution, the tactical decisions involved in executing the president's decision, which we're seeing play out on our television screens every day, including the harrowing, frightening, and chaotic scenes that we saw at Kabul airport just a couple of days ago. Today's discussion is going to focus on the impact of the Afghanistan developments on the region that is the focus of the Washington Institute, namely on the broader Middle East. And I am delighted to be able to first urge everyone to go to the Institute's website to check on the written analysis by many of my colleagues here at the Institute. That's www.washingtoninstitute.org. Today, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome three of my colleagues who will bring their own expertise on these issues to this audience, and then we'll be here to take your questions. And before I introduce them, let me tell you that there are two ways that you can pose questions to engage in our discussion on the implications of the Afghan withdrawal for U.S. policy in the Middle East. First, if you're on Zoom, you may use the chat function, which you'll find in the lower bar of your screen. If you're not on Zoom, if you're using one of the many other platforms through which you can view today's events, please send an email directly to me, rsatloff, RSATLOFF, at washingtoninstitute.org. With that, I'm now happy to introduce the panelists for today's event. First speaking will be Kathryn Wheelbarger. Katie Wilberger is the Institute's Rosenblatt Visiting Fellow, where she focuses on U.S. security and defense policy in the Middle East. Previously, she served as Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. She has extensive experience on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the executive and legislative branches, in dealing with the politics and the policy of these sorts of issues. And I'll be delighted to give Katie the microphone in just a moment. After we hear from her, we'll turn to Dr. Aaron Zelin. Aaron is the Institute's Richard Burrow Fellow and an expert on global jihadist movements. And Aaron will be focusing on what is, of course, the originally fundamental reason why we're in Afghanistan, which is to dismantle and prevent the resurgence of Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups that attacked us on September 11th, 2001. And we'll hear from Aaron on what the potential for the reconstitution of these groups in Afghanistan is and the threat that they may pose to our homeland. And then we'll turn to Dr. Patrick Clawson, the Morningstar Senior Fellow at the Institute and Director of Research here, a specialist on Iran, the head of our Iran program at the Institute. Patrick will talk on what the impact of the Afghan withdrawal on this important neighbor who is itself engaged in a gray zone campaign against the United States that we've seen in so many different fronts, and what the impact of having the arrival of a jihadist Sunni extremist government next to Iran will have on the new leadership in Tehran. So first I'll turn to Katie Wheelbarger, then Aaron Zelin, then Patrick Clawson, and look forward to your questions afterwards. Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on this important issue that's moving quite rapidly as we see. I think from my perspective, and again, having served in the Department of Defense and looking at this very much from a defense and security viewpoint, the withdrawal and the method of the withdrawal presents both significant challenges in the near and long term, but also some opportunities. And I think we need to try to focus on how to move forward from this decision and as we deal with the ramifications on a daily basis. I think much is being spoken of recently on what this decision, and again, the implementation of the decision, means for US credibility around the world, but specifically in the Middle East. What does this mean for our security partnerships and other operational activities throughout the region? And I think it's important first to make sure that we don't quickly overdiagnose the challenges in Afghanistan and apply that across the region. Afghanistan has its own unique challenges, and we also had our own unique partnerships with the security forces in Afghanistan. And there's reasons for why we ended up here today. But that doesn't necessarily, and I think it doesn't actually at all implicate our relationships with other countries in the world and in the region at a security and defense level. If anything, I think some of the ramifications and rhetoric that we're hearing coming out of the pictures and the results of the withdrawal perhaps is an opportunity in the United States in particular to reevaluate the views we have about ending forever wars and what that means for US security interests and regional interests writ large. Specifically, I think the evolution of this Afghanistan campaign and withdrawal has us really focused again on the importance of US security cooperation and presence, our military presence in Iraq and Syria in particular. And I think I'm heartened from the results in many ways that came out of the recently enacted security dialogue that we had, strategic dialogue that we had with Iraq in particular, because even though we did announce that we are recognizing basically the change in US posture from a combat posture to a train and equip mission, what this has done again on a bipartisan multi-administration level is that we have committed to an ongoing military presence and security cooperation with our Iraqi partners. And I think that that is even more important as we see the ramifications of the withdrawal and perhaps some instability in the region, that Iraq, which has been seen, I think, from my perspective, again, serving in both Congress and in the executive branch, it's somewhat a center of gravity of our security situation in the Middle East, that we continue to ensure the security and stability of Iraq. And in that regard, we also see our NATO partners in particular seeking to increase their presence in Iraq from 400 current secure troops to potentially 4,000. And I think that highlights once again the European interest in also ensuring a stable and secure region. They participate with us in an 83-member de-ISIS coalition that is global, but also very focused on Iraq and Syria. And so I think the global community continues to care very much about regional stability and security in the Middle East. And I do think, again, that there's an opportunity to show that perhaps leaving a country too soon or leaving under less than ideal conditions can have ramifications that you don't expect. And so perhaps in the American dialogue, this can help us have an even stronger focus on continuing our presence against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but also our security partnerships in those countries to ensure ongoing future stability. I also think the United States and the region has the benefit of decades-long security cooperation agreements and partnerships with countries around the region. And that's something that in times of chaos or crisis or instability in one part of the world, we can really advance our interests by focusing on and perhaps doing even more than we're currently doing in the security and defense realm with our partners in the region. And if I were advising the Biden administration, I would advise not just to have meetings or phone calls where we discuss things or reassure them with our words, but actually come up with very concrete plans with each of our key partners in the region on what more we can be doing, what their needs are, what they see as potential instability inside their own borders, and what more we can do to be advancing our mutual interests, whether that's advancing more joint programs, looking on further cyber cooperation, how we can deal together with the potential challenges of the CT fight in Afghanistan as in a regional perspective. I think something else that we need to be however, is very clear with our partners about US resource restraints. One of my concerns, particularly right now about Afghanistan, is the amount of time and energy it's unfortunately having to take from senior leaders across the government, so they're not able to focus on other maybe higher priorities. The entire purpose of, I think, at least reading from both parties, the idea of the withdrawal from Afghanistan was to allow us to focus our resources more concretely on what we see as our more acute regional and global priorities. At the moment, I would say there's probably a preoccupation that's not being allowed at the moment, largely because of the way the withdrawal was conducted. That said, we still have significant resources and assets in the region. We should be looking to our partnerships, security partnerships, defense partnerships around the region, and on what more we can be doing together. But I also think it stands to be very clear early on that we do face resource constraints. And as we're looking at, and I'll allow Aaron to speak more on this, but as we're looking to the sort of the global fight against jihadism, or particularly the regional fight, the challenges that Afghanistan poses now that we don't have a ground presence is going to put some strains on our military's capability to be in multiple places at once. So if you look at our CENTCOM region, we already have significant air assets that are devoted to particularly Syria and Iraq. And now if we are going to try to implement what the president has suggested is an over-the-horizon capability in Afghanistan, that's going to put some significant strains on our resource allocations in these other priority countries. So again, I think it's important to be very clear. I personally have doubts about whether that over-the-horizon capability will be effective at all. It's very hard to conduct counterterrorism operations both in the near term or in the long term without a ground presence, being able to tell you where these groups are, who's a part of them, and what they're doing. In terms of, again, I want to, again, on looking at the opportunities though, I think there's global recognition on the importance of stability in the region, that this may just make that attention even more acute. I think we also, we have to continue to be clear with our partners that the purpose of this withdrawal, which is to allow us again to focus on more strategic priorities, involves not just the region, but also our global requirements to look at great power competition with Russia, but most importantly, China. So we have to be very clear-eyed with partners in the region and elsewhere that we're looking to partner together to take on these global challenges. And hopefully over time, as the Afghanistan withdrawal concludes, those efforts and the resource will actually be saved over the long term, so we can focus our energies on both regional and global challenges that I think we really do face together. I think I'm about at 10 minutes, so with that, I'll close it there, but I look forward to everybody's questions.
All right, thank you very much, Katie. We'll turn now to Aaron, but before I turn the microphone to Aaron, I misspoke earlier when I urged you to use the chat function for your questions. You should use the Q&A function if you're on Zoom for your questions, and we'll factor them into the conversation when our presentations are concluded. All right, so Aaron, the microphone is yours.
Great, thanks, Rob, and thanks for everybody who's watching and listening in. Today, I'm going to talk about what is the current state of play in relation to the jihadi movement. In particular, I'm going to try and cover three things. One is the status of foreign fighters already in Afghanistan. As we know, the issue of foreign fighters is the lifeblood in many respects of this movement. What are the reactions of a number of different groups, in particular Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, as well as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, and what they're saying and what that could mean going forward, as well as sort of known unknowns, meaning things we might know could happen, but we don't really know exactly the full trajectory of it at this point. So in terms of the question of foreign fighters, interestingly enough, back in December 2018, a senior Taliban commander actually told NBC News that the group had around 2,000 to 3,000 foreign fighters in its ranks at that point. It's important to remember that Al-Qaeda has also been embedded in the Taliban over these years. So it's likely that a number of these foreigners that are within the Taliban are actually members of Al-Qaeda themselves. One of the things that's interesting about what we've seen so far in comparison to, say, when we think about the foreign fighters that were in Afghanistan in the 80s or early 90s, when it was mainly a lot of Arabs that went over there, most of the foreign fighters we see nowadays, at least in Afghanistan, have been from surrounding countries, in particular in the Indian subcontinent and in Central Asia. However, with the Taliban's takeover of Kabul and the country in general, it's likely that we might see people coming from other regions. And as we know, in the case of Syria over the last decade, there are a lot more countries that have a lot more jihadists than they ever had before. Besides sort of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State has also had a presence in Afghanistan going back to 2015. Similarly have a cadre of foreign fighters as well. There isn't a particular number. It's definitely not as large as what we've seen with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but it's likely that they'll try and use this as another way to recruit people as well, essentially saying that, you know, we're actually the real Islamic State here, not the Taliban. Afghanistan has a history of foreign fighter mobilizations, extant jihadist networks, and at least a few thousand fighters already on the scene. Victory by the Taliban will likely inspire another mobilization. The question going forward in relation to that is how large will it be? Since the Syrian war, many countries have put into place a number of new laws and preventative measures. Plus, unlike Syria, where it was sort of easy to get there because you got there via Turkey, which has a robust tourism industry and plane network, it's a bit more difficult to get to Afghanistan at some level. So, you know, it's likely we won't see 40 to 50,000 foreign fighters just quickly streaming into Afghanistan right away. But it would not be surprising if we did see people attempting to go there and some of those definitely getting through. So how have jihadis reacted so far, you know, in the last few days or so? Many elements within jihadi movement, especially individuals affiliated with Al-Qaeda's networks or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, have expressed joy, unsurprisingly, over the Taliban swift takeover, viewing it as a confirmation that their patience and ideological steadfastness will bring them favor in God's eyes. Thus far, only Al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen, or AQAP, has put out an official statement. I expect that Al-Qaeda senior leadership, as well as other branches, will in time put out you know, statements related to this as well. But the fact that it's been now 4 days since Kabul fell and only AQAP put out a statement last evening, US time, illustrates once again one of the reasons why ISIS in some respects, as well as HTS, have been able to eclipse Al-Qaeda within the movement over recent years due to some of these deficiencies. This could also be a good opportunity to sort of see what the status of Ayman al-Zawahiri is, the leader of Al-Qaeda, since some people believe since last November that he's either dead or deeply ill, since we haven't heard from him since. So this could be also another potential place to have an idea of what he's been up to. Where AQAB congratulated the Taliban, it said, quote, "We are hopeful in this victory and this historical event. It is the start of a decisive turning point in the modern history of the Muslim Ummah towards revival, dominance, breaking the chains of slavery and subservience, and the expulsion of the invaders from Muslim lands," end quote. As for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, their ideologues were immediately jubilant over the news from Kabul, since they hope to achieve the same thing in Damascus one day. One senior member even wrote a poem for the occasion calling it, "I Love the Taliban." One ideologue, an Egyptian Abu Fattah al-Farghali, exclaimed, quote, "Oh God, bless the men of the Taliban who are true to their covenant with God and did not change. The victory of the Taliban is a lesson for the Islamic nation in steadfastness on the truth until victory is achieved," end quote. Likewise, HTS leader Abu Maria al-Qahtani declared, quote, "The Taliban's victory is a victory for Muslims, a victory for the Sunnis, a victory for all the oppressed," end quote. Thus far, in Idlib itself in Syria, the group has demonstrated their joy in the streets, for instance, by giving baklava away to drivers and passersby, and it's likely that they'll put on a number of events to try and inculcate the local population into this messaging so that they can try and use it going forward to try and push towards what they're attempting to do in Syria. For their part, Islamic State leaders are unlikely to be happy by what happened and the reemergence of the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The victory in many ways takes the shine away from IS's own caliphate project. Tonight, US time, the Islamic State will likely release its weekly newsletter, so we'll find out more, especially what they're going to say. But the Taliban and IS forces have been actively fighting each other now since 2015, when IS first announced its presence there as Wilayat Khorasan, These hostilities seem destined to persist in many respects. The Taliban will no doubt continue its efforts to suppress IS operations in Afghanistan, while IS still detests what it sees as deficiencies in the Taliban's ideology. Just to give an example, in the last few days or so, IS actually attacked the Taliban in Nangarhar province the day before Kabul fell. And during one of the Taliban's prison breaks in recent weeks, it executed the former leader of IS, Abu Umar al-Khorasani, who had been imprisoned for his activities in the Puli Sharqi prison. So you could see that even while the Taliban has been doing these prison breaks, it's been keen to decipher between those who might be actual operatives of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda versus those who might be with the Islamic State itself. In terms of known unknowns, they sort of include the status of those released from the prisons itself by the Taliban and the potential AQ operatives that are amongst them. This outflow of jihadi veterans will likely help jumpstart AQ's efforts to rebuild its local infrastructure. However, at this point, it's hard to know who these individuals are and what they previously had done. So some insights will hopefully be garnered in the future. A related question is how many AQ operatives outside of Afghanistan will now try to return now that the Taliban is in power. Of particular interest is Saif al-Adil, who's seen as a potential heir to Al-Qaeda's Ayman al-Zawahiri. However, since the post 9/11 timeframe, he's been in Iran, originally imprisoned, then under house arrest. It'll be interesting to see how Iran deals with this, whether they might use it as a bargaining chip with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. It's hard to say, or if they might just release him, since it could be viewed from their perspective tactically a good thing, since it could create problems for the United States down the road then. Other potential returnees include AQ leaders who had transferred from Afghanistan to Syria in the past decade to join up with Jabhat al-Nusra and then later Huras ad-Din to assist with the organization's branch in Syria. There are rumors, especially since HTS cracked down on Al-Qaeda in June 2020, that those amongst them that have not been killed in US drone strikes or have not been arrested by HTS are seeking ways to return to Afghanistan now. So these are ways that you can have some historical leaders once again returning to Afghanistan, even if many of the current operatives might be more local or regional actors. To finish, it's important to remember that the CT infrastructure built since 9/11 will give the US far more robust options these days than they had beforehand in dealing with this problem set. However, the PON on-the-ground intelligence infrastructure relied on over the last 20 years is now changing or disappearing altogether. So there will be new challenges in trying to directly interdict future external operations by Al-Qaeda or even possibly the Islamic State. Either way, the return of the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has in many ways inspired and reinvigorated Al-Qaeda's cadres to continue on their path, given HTS a model to follow in Syria, and annoyed the Islamic State since they're competitors.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Fascinating. Again, to get your questions into this conversation, please email me directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org or use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll turn now to Patrick Clawson to talk about the Iranian angle of the implications of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Patrick.
There are strong reasons to anticipate that Iran would be hostile to the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. Let me just kick off a few of them. One is the history. In the 1990s, Iran put tremendous efforts into helping those fighting the Taliban. Iran was the godfather for the creation of the Northern Alliance. It was fighting the Taliban. At one point, the Kyrgyz authorities intercepted a train that had 16 cars full of humanitarian supplies that turned out to be arms and ammunition that were going from Iran to the Northern Alliance. In 1998, after the Taliban overran northern Afghanistan and killed some Iranian diplomats, the Iranians mobilized 200,000 troops on their border and seriously considered invading Afghanistan to go to war with the Taliban. They decided not to. But this history is, shall we say, one of deep hostility. A second reason is the Shia connection. Iran sees itself as the protector of Shia communities around the world. And the last time they were in power, the Taliban were viciously anti-Shia. After they overran the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif in 1998, the Taliban slaughtered somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 ethnic Hazara Shia in probably the single worst humanitarian disaster that they created. And then a third reason is drugs. Iran has a tremendous opium problem, much worse than the US opioid problem, probably about 10 times worse than the opioid problem here in the United States, with quite a substantial percentage of the young Iranian men addicted to opium and opium products. And those all come from Afghanistan, and the Taliban organize and profit from that trade. Yet another reason is concern about unrest. The Iranians are convinced, probably mistakenly, that the Taliban has been a major factor in the Jundallah movement in Baluchistan and southeastern Iran, a viciously anti-Sunni group that's openly separatist, which Iran has fought for years and pitched battles between the Revolutionary Guards and that group. And also the new Iranian government of Mr. Raisi is going to be particularly sensitive to the danger of Afghan-inspired unrest because that government is so dominated by people who come from Mashhad, which is in northeastern Iran, the second largest city, very close to the Afghan border. Among Mashhad's 3 million people are several hundred thousand, by some accounts, 500,000 Afghans. And then finally, there are the traditional reasons for Afghan-Iranian differences that predate the Islamic Republic and certainly the Taliban rule. For instance, the two have long been at odds over the division of waters from the Helmand River, which is Afghanistan's longest river. And this is a particularly sensitive issue in this drought-stricken year. So there are all these reasons to anticipate that Iran would be unhappy with the Taliban victory, but that's not what's happened. The fact is that over the last decade, the Iranian approach towards the Taliban has shifted. And some signs of this are that since 2015, Iran's supreme leader, who used to make frequent caustic, insulting comments about the Taliban, has not said one single word of criticism of the Taliban. In 2016, when the Taliban finally acknowledged that their longtime leader, Mullah Omar, was dead, there were two leading contenders to replace him, and both of them had spent many months in Iran. Indeed, one of them, Mr. Akhtar Mohammad Mansour, was killed by a US drone strike while he was driving from Iran to his home in Pakistan. Then, moving forward to 2018, the Supreme National Security Council head in Iran, Ali Shamkhani, quite an influential figure in Iranian politics, visited Kabul. And according to the Dean of American Afghan Studies, Barnett Rubin at Columbia, Shamkhani openly told the Afghan government that Iran was providing arms and ammunition to the Taliban, and he was not going to change his policies. Then we come forward to the more recent period, and what we see is that Iran has, at most, mixed signals about the Taliban victory. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry is referred to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is the official title the Taliban want to give to them. The Iranians have kept their embassy open in downtown Kabul. And all of the trade crossing points between Iran and Afghanistan have remained open. They only closed for a few days when the Taliban were taking over. By the way, I'm no expert in Afghanistan, but the Asian Development Bank, in a report 2 years ago, said that 70% of Afghanistan's imports come via Iran. And Iran sells directly a lot to Afghanistan. In the month ending July 22nd, the sales were $258 million worth of Iranian goods to Afghanistan, one of their largest trading partners. So what we have seen is a focus in the Iranian media and by Iranian government officials on the US defeat. And that has been their principal concern. So Shamkhani, for instance, tweeted about how this should be a defeat of foreign occupation, should be a signal to the Zionists of what to expect in Palestine. And to be sure, there are still remain suspicions that, as a headline in one influential Iranian newspaper put it, that the don't prettify the Taliban. They're basically a sectarian Sunni Pushtun force. However, we'll see what happens. I mean, for instance, today is Ashura, probably the single most important day in the religious calendar of Shia, and one that's detested by Sunnis. And the Taliban help provide security for the Ashura ceremonies in Mazar-e-Sharif, and also coordinated with the Shia leaders in Herat, another major city quite close to the Iranian border, not that far from Mashhad. So if that's what the Taliban do, then I think that the Iranian focus is going to remain on the U.S. defeat. Of course, it could change. Like, for instance, we saw that Iran for a long time cooperated with the forces fighting the Sunni extremist forces fighting the United States in Iraq, even though those people and Al-Qaeda in Iraq were engaged in a vicious slaughter of Shia inside Iraq, and the Shia who were quite closely aligned with Iran. But Iran was willing to work with them in a common anti-American agenda until Iran felt that there was a threat that those people posed to Iran itself. So when the Islamic State overran northern Iraq, there was the perception, very deeply felt inside Iran, that they were coming to Iran next, and that not just the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, but Iran itself was a threat. And that certainly was exacerbated by the attack in July 2017. And one day, the Islamic State attacked both the Iranian Majlis building in Tehran and also the Khomeini's tomb in Tehran, and killing 17 people. So there was this perception that the Islamic State was coming to take on Iran, and therefore Iran became very hostile to them. And it's conceivable that that's what will happen here as well. But so far we see no indications of that at all. So let me close by offering a couple of comments about lessons this offers the United States. One is that the Iranian regime places great priority on its hostility to the United States and is prepared to swallow a lot in order to cooperate with those who are hostile to the United States. And from that, I conclude that it's frankly futile to think that the United States is going to be able to reach agreement with Iran in follow-on talks post the nuclear deal about matters like missiles or Iran's regional activities. Iran might agree to something on a tactical basis, but then just simply go about the same objectives in a different way. They agree to restrictions on missiles, but then use drones instead. So I would frankly not give a priority to that. On the other hand, I would also learn the lesson that it's a mistake to think that Iran is going to give up its nuclear ambitions, and that therefore it's a mistake to have sunset clauses in any nuclear deal with Iran. And I would say that the U.S. focus on what it wants in a longer and stronger nuclear deal should be on longer and stronger nuclear restrictions on Iran, because Iran is not likely to change, the Islamic Republic of Iran is not likely to change its strategic hostility to the United States during the time frame of before those sunset clauses come into effect. So I would conclude by saying that how Iran has changed its approach towards the Taliban from one of being willing to cooperate with the United States in an anti-Taliban effort back when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, to now where Iran works with the Taliban in spite of all these reasons for historical hostility, because the Taliban is hostile to the United States, and that's what matters most to Iran. That lesson should be factored into how we approach negotiations with Iran. Expect tactical agreements, but not a strategic shift.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you. Again, if you have questions, email me at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org, or use the Q&A function on the Zoom. Let me just ask open this by playing off comments that both you, Katie, and you, Aaron, made regarding the ability of the United States to counter or even monitor the resurgence of Al-Qaeda inside a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Katie, you referred to the what you thought were complications with having an over-the-horizon counterterrorism response. Aaron, I want to ask about. You referred to the CT infrastructure that has been built up over the last 20 years, but here the question is, how much of that infrastructure was itself dependent on the presumption that we would be in Afghanistan, as we have been over the last 20 years. So I'd like to ask both of you to expand a bit on just the counterterrorism challenges that we could very well face with a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Katie?
Sure. I think the U.S. decision to remove all forces from Afghanistan, even before the Taliban took over, was set to pose us significant challenges from a CT perspective, from our ability to continue to conduct CT operations against Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other extremist groups, particularly in eastern Afghanistan. It's some of the most treacherous terrain on the planet in terms of just the mountainscape. And it's one of the reasons it became a safe haven in the first place. It's really hard to see from the air what is going on in those mountains. And from my perspective, many have lost sight of the fact that, or at least from my view, much of what we were doing in Afghanistan in terms of building up the Afghan army or security forces was to allow the Afghan commandos and some of our more elite special operators to continue to conduct counterterrorism operations, primarily in eastern Afghanistan. It's sort of the overall effort to sort of build a security infrastructure and a governing structure for Afghanistan is what was giving us the time and space to continue to put pressure on the groups that are of most concern to U.S. security, which is obviously Al-Qaeda and ISIS, given that they were able to conduct a very significant operation against us 20 years ago from that location. So I have serious doubts that we will be able to know what those groups are doing, how they are coalescing, and what they're planning, or who is even a part of them, if we don't have forces on the ground that can monitor and sort of put pressure on them to reveal themselves. I mean, we've seen over the years, even with our presence, that some Al-Qaeda elements can go months or years with hiding some training camps in those mountains or the caves that we did not know existed for a long period of time. Of course, we were in a position when we did learn about them over the years to take action against them. But I do worry that we won't be able to, that we are going to be blinded in what's going on there. And as Aaron alluded to, the idea that we have learned how to do over the horizon in places like, and over the horizon, just for those who are not focused on it, means that you're doing all of your operations from outside the borders of that particular country. And the suggestion that we have done so in places like Syria and Yemen is just not factually true. We do have forces on the ground, the limited numbers in both Syria and Yemen, and we have been partnered with on the ground in Yemen for years to go after AQAP. But those countries also have a significant benefit of that they are near coastal areas where it's easier for us to have a presence locally. Even if we don't have a significant ground force, you do have air assets in particular that can get very close to the country's borders. The problem with Afghanistan, in addition to not having boots on the ground that can monitor these groups close in close terrain, it's very far from our other placed assets in the region. So you're talking about whether it be unmanned aircraft or manned aircraft that are going to have to fly significant distances, many hours, before they can even get to Afghanistan to hopefully do some loitering time to actually try to see what's going on in that terrain. It's going to put a severe stress on our air resources at a time that we've already been very stressed for the last 20 years. And I'll just close by saying Syria taught us in 2014 that trying to conduct CT operations without any ground presence just simply does not work. And that nearly broke the backbone of the Air Force when we tried that in 2014. And much to his chagrin, President Obama finally realized he could not do it without some partner force, and that meant US presence on the ground. And so as much as we tried to conduct over the horizon in Syria, it eventually did not work, and we had to go in there with some forces on the ground.
Very interesting. Thank you, Katie. Aaron, your view on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the key parts of this is the fact that we've had partner forces on the ground, whether it's actual governments or sort of non-state actors that have been working with the United States to help out with a lot of the intelligence on the ground. So without that, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And another problem related to that is that the Taliban has claimed that Al-Qaeda is not even in Afghanistan. I mean, they were claiming that even before 9/11, let's be honest. So they're not going to be helpful at all. And if you look at the most recent UN report about Al-Qaeda, at least it claims that they're in 15 of the 34 provinces, and that came out a couple of weeks ago. I imagine that now that the Taliban is in control, this could spread out even farther. And then on top of that, you know, there's always the complicated relationship we've had with Pakistan, because the Pakistani ISI, or intelligence services, essentially has been the backers of the Taliban going back to the beginning in the 90s. And thus far as I'm aware, Katie might be able to have more insights onto this, is that I know that the US has at least tried to talk to countries like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan on the northern border to try and work out a military bases there, but nothing's come of that yet. And therefore, you have this dilemma that's going to be happening going forward now.
Rob, if I might chime in, let's not exaggerate the degree to which the Taliban are going to control Afghanistan, and they may not have a real handle on some of these groups that are operating in their territory. I mean, we take a look at how when a Taliban group started in Pakistan, the TTP, the Afghan Taliban were not particularly happy about this. In fact, there were some armed pitch battles between the two, but didn't really stop it. So it may well be the case that the Taliban is not interested in doing anything about these people, about these jihadists, but it also could be the case that, frankly, they just couldn't.
Katie, you wanted to come in here?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of answer one of the other questions I see about what to follow up on that, which is whether it's the level of Pakistan's influence over the Taliban. And as Aaron rightly says, for a long period of time, the Pakistanis have basically provided or have been a patron for the Taliban. There's long historical reasons for that, and which primarily goes to their interest in ensuring that they have some influence over the Afghan government, such that it doesn't align with their with India. And also foment some instability within Pakistan's minority groups. But of course, that level of influence on a day-to-day basis is questionable. They definitely provided safe haven. They provided monetary support and probably weapons. But at the same point, as Patrick says, the Taliban is its own organization. I think Pakistan and other aligned countries will likely try to influence the Taliban's control over some of these extremist groups, particularly, I mean, Pakistan is very concerned about the rise of ISIS on their border, but there's reason to be skeptical that as any patron of another country's armed militia, that they don't have absolute control over what the Taliban do, even now that they are governing the country.
All right, let me ask you, Patrick. You made some, I think, really fascinating observations about how Iran prioritizes hostility to the United States over, say, fear of, the rise of a Sunni jihadist on its border, and then you concluded with some suggestions regarding potential future negotiations with Iran. But let me ask you about the what is the current stated goal of U.S. policy, which is merely to return to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal originally negotiated in 2015. To what extent, if any, do you see the events in Afghanistan having an impact on Iran's decision-making as to whether to accept the Biden administration proposal to go back to the JCPOA?
Well, so far, no major Iranian commentator has spoken about this matter, much less Iranian government officials. Now, that part, that's because today is Ashura, it's a holiday. It's kind of like expecting people to speak about something on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve. Ain't going to happen. But my speculation and I emphasize it as speculation, is that those who are unpersuaded that it's a good idea to engage with the West aren't going to feel that this yet another reason what shows that it's not necessary to deal with the United States, that the United States is really not that powerful, and that Iran should just charge ahead. Raisi's whole approach has been to focus on neighboring countries. And so it'll be interesting to see just how much he devotes to focusing on the situation in Afghanistan. The new heads of the Quds Force, the replacement for the dead Qasem Soleimani, Mr. Qani was an expert on Afghanistan for a long time. And so it's possible that the new Iranian government will decide that its focus is really on its neighbors and not on the negotiations with the U.S. But that so far is just speculation.
So I'm hearing you say that we don't yet have any direct impact on how this might affect the Iranians' position on the JCPOA.
I haven't been able to find a single newspaper article or social media reference to this.
Okay, fair enough. All right, we have a number of questions that are coming in. Let me rephrase one of them in the following sense. Katie, with all the challenges that we've been discussing, I know you mentioned opportunities, but let's actually try to put the best case forward. Assuming we get beyond the current sets of issues regarding extraction of Americans and Afghan supporters of the American role in Afghanistan, what do you see as the best case for the impact of our withdrawal from Afghanistan on our interests in the Middle East?
Sure. I think, well, with a lot of national security decisions, you're choosing amongst bad options. So the best case scenario is not perfection in light of where we are. But I do think, again, with the strategic dialogue that we saw with Iraq coming as the events in Afghanistan were unfolding, plus if we can get through this period of time of instability, particularly address what might be a refugee crisis, I do think this will allow us to focus our energies a lot on what are some of our core interests with respect to when it comes to security cooperation in Iraq and Syria. And that's not just for the benefit of stability in Iraq, but as one of our questions alluded to, the U.S. continuing presence, not just U.S., but coalition presence in Iraq and Iraq stability is really a core attribute of our pushing back against the Iranians. It is, of course, their strategic goal is to have us be removed from Iraq in a similar way that they're seeing us leaving Afghanistan. And so a positive development from this is, we're able to focus our energies and our security discussions more probably focused on Iraq. And so I think one of the goals of this was to allow U.S. security officials and our actual resources to be less distracted by Afghanistan so we can focus on some of our core interests in the region and globally, as I alluded to. But I do think in many ways the wake-up call that I think America is having right now, that again, that withdrawal can cause externalities and complications that maybe we weren't expecting. I have many colleagues and contacts that were very much more pro-withdrawal or ending forever wars than they are right now when they see what actually can happen, both in a humanitarian level, but also to the complications to our own security and the security of our partners. So I do think this is an opportunity to stop having pressure within the US system to pull our troops out of places like Iraq and Syria. And so if we can get to a place of stability that everybody recognizes at a bipartisan basis that it's in our interest to stay in those two countries, to continue to conduct the de-ISIS mission, that can go a long way as well to shoring up our credibility, I think, not only in the Middle East, but with our partners around the world who are equally very interested on continuing this global fight against ISIS. So I think those are some positive benefits that can come out of what has been to date, not the most pleasant of historical experiences.
Okay. You referred to refugee crisis. A number of questioners are posing questions about the potential flow of refugees out of Afghanistan. One of the places that they're likely to head to is, of course, Iran. So, Patrick, what do you think the Iranian view will be at the prospect of a massive refugee flow on its borders?
Well, there were 1 million Afghan immigrants living in Iran before the Islamic Republic. And so there's been a long history of people crossing from Afghanistan to do menial jobs in Iran, frankly, kind of like the U.S. experience with its southern border. And just as the U.S. has found along its southern border, it's really hard to stop determined people who are looking for work in a richer country. So, too, there are going to be a lot of Afghans who'd want to come into Iran, even though there's vicious discrimination against the Afghan immigrants living in Iran. Good luck stopping them. I mean, what? We're going to provide technical assistance to the Iranians on how to secure our southern border? I don't think so. And meanwhile, a lot of those refugees coming into Iran are going to try to cross into Turkey. And so that's what we've seen the Turkish authorities busily constructing border barriers to stop that. Again, good luck. But there's a very large Afghan community in each of Iran's major cities with which where these Afghans can find relatives, can find people to help them get jobs. And Iranians are very much used to employing Afghans for all the jobs they don't want to fill. By the way, Iran's unemployment rate has been dropping in recent years. The number of people who are turning 22 in Iran is less than half of what it was 10 years ago because of a birth dearth that Iran experienced. And as a result, there's going to be Iranian employers who are looking for Afghans to hire.
So I'm hearing you say that the Iranians are unlikely to put up a 20-foot high fence to do everything they can to prevent the flow of refugees into their country.
The Iranians may put up a 20-foot fence and may also cut holes in it.
Okay. Aaron, let me ask you a question that draws on your earlier comment regarding ISIS, Al-Qaeda competition, and the Taliban ISIS confrontations that you referred to. If we see Al-Qaeda having a more hospitable home in Afghanistan, are we likely to see renewed efforts by ISIS to have more of a territorial, or at least more of a series of headline events that underscore the competition that they will perceive from Al-Qaeda? Are we going to see an ISIS Al-Qaeda upping of the ante, tit for tat, in which only we and our partners and friends will suffer?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a possibility. We've seen outbidding between the groups in the past, whether it's been in Syria. There have been some cases of it in Mali region as well, and even Yemen to a lesser extent. But since ISIS lost its territorial control in Syria in March 2019, it's obviously continued to have a low boiling insurgency in both of those countries since. But one of the areas where it's been attempting to exploit the most has been in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in Mali, and even places as far south as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mozambique. So they've been keeping themselves busy outside of the large-scale headlines, since most people aren't paying attention really to those countries, in the same way that they might with countries that are more well-known or closer to one's own homes. ISIS will have a difficult time trying to take over territory in Afghanistan just because of the fact that the Taliban doesn't want to see it happening. It's the same awkward and weird kind of dynamic you see between Hamas and ISIS in Gaza, where, you know, obviously they both have a certain level of Islamist ideology and are, of course, anti-Israel and the like, but Hamas sees ISIS as a threat to their own power base. And in the same way, the Taliban views ISIS also that way. And part of that is also because of their own ideological views. As alluded to by Patrick before, at least thus far, the Taliban has been protecting these Ashura celebrations, and even put out a statement in Herat saying that mosques and shrines or Seniyat should be protected, which will be a key ideological problem for ISIS. And I wouldn't be surprised if ISIS tried to do attacks against Shiites in Afghanistan to then try and create tensions between the Taliban and Iran, which could then potentially be beneficial to ISIS, because any chaos or vacuum is always better for the Islamic State in many respects. One of the biggest questions, I think, because if you look at sort of the external operations capacities, at least of ISIS, is that it's mainly been done from Iraq, Syria, or Libya, not really any of these more external outerlying provinces, at least that's what they call them, from their core territories. So it'll be interesting to see if they have more space, if they want to try and do that. But it will definitely be more difficult than the open spaces that they previously had in places like Iraq, Syria, and Libya when they actually controlled territory.
Okay, thank you. Katie, I'd like to come back to one of the comments you made near the close of your opening presentation on what the U.S. can do with local partners, especially in the Middle East, to address their security concerns right now, given that many of our partners may be wobbly about the strength of America's fundamental security commitments. Are there specific, on the one hand, are there specific warning signs that Washington should be looking out for our local partners hedging their bets on their relationships with the United States? And secondly, are there any more specifics you can give us on the types of things the United States should be doing individually and collectively with Arab states in the Gulf, with Israel, with them together, with other states in the region that would be a sign of reassurance at this moment?
Sure. And as I stated, I'm a big believer in signs of reassurance that aren't just platitudes or written statements, but actually talking to our partners and learning what their security challenges are, and then helping them address them. And we do have, extremely robust security relationships with, other than Iran, and Syria, most countries in the region. And I think, especially as events unfold in Afghanistan, to the extent regional partners are worried about the rise of ISIS or in that territory, or what a refugee crisis might do for instability, what more specific joint programs we might be able to do with these partners across the range of U.S. tools. So I don't want to highlight just the security footprint, because there's also, there's USAID programs, there's other development programs, and of course our diplomatic footprint. You said, what are warning signs that we should look for? And we've seen it for years, but one of the concerns, particularly with some of our Gulf partners, is the extent to which they're questioning American commitment to the region's security, and they're looking for alternative patrons, particularly Russia or Russia or China for security cooperation.
Canada. Yes.
More Canada. I'm all about more
Canadians.
Russia or China providing advanced security capabilities, or even with respect to China, potentially actually seeking to have a greater footprint in the region, whether that be bases or otherwise, like we see in Djibouti. The rise of cooperation or arrangements with Russia or China poses a particular challenge, not only to our ability to influence the region, but also from a very technical standpoint with respect to our security cooperation programs. We see this, for example, with Turkey. We just simply cannot provide Turkey our F-35s, our most advanced fifth generation fighter on which our defense relies, if they also have the Russian-made S-400 secure defense system, air defense system. So I think the more we can be clear with our partners on where our red lines are with their potential outreach to Russia and China for the certain systems, the easier it will be for us to continue to show them that we are, in fact, the security partner of choice. And whatever is happening in Afghanistan, I think it's important to really highlight the extent of our programs across the region, and just the billions of dollars over generations that the United States taxpayers have provided to our partners in the region. And that comes with not just a dollar sign, but actually relationships that have been built across the security sectors for decades. That, our partners, whether they be Jordanians or Israelis or the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and the years that we've spent with UAE and Saudi Arabia trying to address their security concerns and advance their security forces. That's not something that is I think we have a lot of continued goodwill that we should focus on advancing. And I can't sit here where I am and necessarily know what in Afghanistan is of more concern to each of these countries in terms of the potential ramifications for instability, but I'm certain they each have their own unique vantage point and concerns. And if we can develop, again, there's so many things that we do in terms of joint programs where both countries get the benefit of technological advancement that can help both the challenges in that particular country, but also can come back and help U.S. interests as well. As a good example is our efforts with Israel on U.S. or on anti-tunneling technology. Our joint program with Israel to find those tunnels and figure out how to destroy them has been very important for Israel's security, but the technological advancement that program has allowed can come back and be infused back into our technological systems to help U.S. security as well, whether that be border security or elsewhere. So there's a lot of mutual interest to continuing these security partnerships and advancing them sort of every day, week and month, and really listening to our partners on what is of concern today based on events as they're unfolding.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Patrick, a question for you that has come in based on an earlier comment you made about, I think you said the 16 cars of support on the train that the Iranians gave the Northern Alliance years ago. We've seen on the pages of the Washington Post, we've seen statements and actions in parts of Afghanistan that an opposition to the Taliban has begun to coalesce once again. Having gone through the last 20 years, having seen the Americans come and go, do you think how do you think the Iranians are going to react this time to a reconstituted Northern Alliance? Are they likely to be a patron, or are they likely to throw their lot in with what seems to be the victors in Kabul?
Well, in place after place around the world, what we've seen is that use the phrase that U.S. officials in Iraq like to use, the Iranians place bets on every horse in the race. So, for instance, after the United States chased a lot of al-Qaeda leaders into Iran in 2003, one of the U.S. officials involved in negotiations with the Iranians about getting those people rendered to the United States said the Iranian attitude is, well, we handed over most of them, but of course we're going to keep some. And so that was also the Iranian approach towards helping al-Qaeda in Iraq, is that they were both helping al-Qaeda in Iraq and helping the Iraqi forces that were fighting against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so I would assume that the attitude of the Iranians is going to be to simultaneously seek good relations with the Taliban and also to work with whoever's opposed to them. There was a wonderful report from a major think tank shortly before the U.S. invasion, before the September 11th attacks, which was describing how the Iranian government had put a lot of efforts into building up the Northern Alliance at the same time that the Quds Force, the IRGC in Iran, was putting a lot of effort into helping the Taliban. So the normal approach of the Iranians is going to be to work with everybody, and that's what I assume they'll do this time. But I have seen no indication. That's my speculation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. All right. Well, we are. I think we have exhausted the questions that I've received, and the three of you have offered very prescient and insightful remarks. So I always think it's good to go out when on a high note. And so with that, I'm going to thank you all, Kathryn Wheelbarger Aaron Zelin, Patrick Clawson. Thank you for joining us and with your observations. Again, I urge all of our viewers, please go to the website of the Washington Institute, www.washingtoninstitute.org, to view the written analysis by our colleagues on various aspects of the implications of the American withdrawal and the Taliban victory for U.S. policy in the broader Middle East. Thank you all for joining us here at the Washington Institute. Bye-bye.